In the year 1600, a single afternoon of fighting in a fog-soaked valley in central Japan decided who would rule the country for the next 2.5 centuries. The man who won that battle did not crown himself king. He did not build a vast palace and demand worship. Instead, he built something far stranger and far more durable. He built a machine for keeping the peace, a system so tightly engineered that it locked an entire nation of 30 million people into roughly the same shape for over 260 years. Borders were sealed. The roads were watched. The most powerful warlords in the land were turned into something close to hostages, shuffled back and forth across the country on a schedule. For most of human history, peace this long was almost unheard of. And then, almost overnight, 4 foreign ships sailed into a bay near the capital, and the whole structure began to come apart. This is the complete story of how the Tokugawa family seized Japan, how they held it, and how they lost it. If you are enjoying this so far, hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel more than you would think. Now here is a question I want you to sit with as we go. Imagine you are a low-ranking samurai in the year 1600. Sword at your hip, no battle left to fight, no enemy left to face. What do you do with a life built entirely for war, in a country that has suddenly decided it is done with war? Drop your answer in the comments. To understand the Tokugawa, you first have to understand what came before them, because the peace they created only makes sense against the violence it replaced. For more than a century, Japan had been tearing itself apart. This is the story of the men who ended that, the family that profited from it, and the slow, strange, brilliant, and ultimately doomed order they constructed. We are going to move through all 15 Tokugawa shoguns, the wars that made them, the culture that flowered under them, and the crisis that finally swept them away. Stay with me. By the end, the modern world of samurai films and shogun dramas will look completely different to you, because you will know what was actually happening underneath. The age of the country at war. For most of the 1500s, Japan did not really have a central government in any meaningful sense. On paper, there was an emperor in Kyoto and a military government called the Ashikaga Shogunate. In practice, both had collapsed into near total irrelevance. The emperor was so poor at one point that the court could barely afford to perform the proper funeral rites for a deceased sovereign. The real power lay with regional warlords called daimyo, and there were dozens of them, each commanding their own armies, their own castles, and their own slice of territory. Historians call this era the Sengoku period, which translates roughly to the age of the country at war. It was exactly what it sounds like. Daimyo fought daimyo for land and survival. Alliances formed and shattered within a single season. A retainer might murder his lord and seize his domain, a pattern so common it had its own name, Gekkokujo, meaning the low overcoming the high. A peasant could, in theory, rise to rule a province if he was clever and ruthless enough. The old certainties of birth and rank had broken down, and into that chaos came men of enormous ambition. The fighting itself changed dramatically in this period, and the reason was a piece of technology that arrived by accident. In 1543, a Chinese ship carrying Portuguese traders was blown off course and ran aground on a small island south of Kyushu. The Portuguese had matchlock guns. The local Japanese were fascinated, bought a couple of the weapons, and within a few years, Japanese smiths were producing firearms of their own in large numbers. War in Japan would never be the same. Massed ranks of foot soldiers carrying guns began to matter more than individual mounted warriors trading blows in single combat. Out of this swirl of violence, 3 men emerged who would, between them, drag Japan back toward unity. They are remembered together, and there is an old saying that captures how the Japanese themselves understood the differences between them. It involves a stubborn bird that will not sing. The first man says, "If the bird does not sing, kill it." The second says, "If the bird does not sing, make it want to sing." The third says, "If the bird does not sing, wait, and it will sing eventually." Those three temperaments belong to Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Our story runs through all three, but it ends with the patient one. Oda Nobunaga was the first to seize real momentum. He was a minor daimyo from the province of Owari, considered something of an eccentric and a fool in his youth, who turned out to be one of the most ruthless and innovative commanders Japan had ever produced. In 1560, his small force ambushed and destroyed a vastly larger invading army at the Battle of Okehazama, killing the enemy commander and announcing himself to the entire country. Nobunaga embraced the new firearms enthusiastically, drilled his gunners to fire in rotating volleys, and crushed the famous cavalry of his rivals. He marched into Kyoto, installed a puppet shogun, and then discarded him. He burned the great fortified monastery complexes that had defied secular power for centuries, slaughtering thousands of monks and their families without hesitation. By the early 1580s, Nobunaga controlled the center of Japan and seemed poised to finish the job of unification. He never got the chance. In 1582, while resting at a temple in Kyoto with only a small guard, Nobunaga was betrayed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, who surrounded the temple with troops. Trapped, and with no way out, Nobunaga died there, most likely by his own hand as the building burned around him. The most powerful man in Japan was gone in a single night, and the question of who would inherit his unfinished work was suddenly wide open. Here is something most people do not know about Nobunaga. He was genuinely curious about the wider world and kept a retainer of African origin named Yasuke, a man who had arrived in Japan with Jesuit missionaries. Yasuke served as a samurai in Nobunaga's household, a remarkable position for a foreigner in 16th century Japan. The man who avenged Nobunaga and seized his legacy was not his son or his most senior general. It was a soldier of astonishingly humble origins named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who had risen from a peasant background, possibly as a lowly sandal bearer, all the way to the top ranks of Nobunaga's army through sheer talent and relentless drive. Within 2 weeks of Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi marched his army back, defeated the treacherous Akechi Mitsuhide, and positioned himself as the avenger and natural successor. Over the next several years, he outmaneuvered Nobunaga's other generals, defeated or won over the remaining independent daimyo, and by 1590 had brought all of Japan under his command. The country was unified for the first time in over 100 years. Hideyoshi could never become shogun himself, because that title traditionally required descent from a specific noble lineage, and his peasant birth made the claim impossible. So he took other grand court titles instead and ruled as a kind of supreme regent. He was a brilliant administrator as well as a soldier. He ordered a nationwide land survey to assess exactly how much rice every piece of territory produced, which gave him a precise measure of every daimyo's wealth and military potential. And he carried out one of the most consequential policies in Japanese history, the Great Sword Hunt, confiscating weapons from peasants and commoners across the country. The goal was to draw a hard line between the warrior class, who could carry swords, and everyone else who could not. That single distinction would shape Japanese society for the next 2.5 centuries. But Hideyoshi's ambition did not stop at Japan's shores. In the 1590s, he launched 2 enormous invasions of Korea, intending ultimately to conquer Ming China itself. The campaigns were brutal, vastly destructive, and ultimately failures. Japanese armies bogged down against Korean resistance and Chinese intervention, and the famous Korean admiral Yi Sun-sin shattered Japanese fleets with his ironclad turtle ships. The invasions drained resources and exhausted the daimyo who had to supply troops. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, his Korean adventure collapsed, and his armies came home with nothing to show for the bloodshed. Hideyoshi died, leaving a single young son, Toyotomi Hideyori, only 5 years old. To protect the boy and preserve his own family's rule, Hideyoshi had set up a council of 5 of the most powerful daimyo in Japan, sworn to govern jointly until Hideyori came of age. It was a fragile arrangement, and everyone knew it. The most powerful member of that council, the largest landholder in all of Japan, was a patient, cautious, deeply calculating man who had been quietly building his strength for decades while waiting for exactly this kind of opening. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu and the battle for Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu had survived a childhood that would have broken most people. He was born in 1543 into a minor warrior family caught between 2 far more powerful neighbors. As a small boy, he was sent away as a hostage to guarantee his family's loyalty, a common practice at the time. On the way, he was kidnapped and held by a rival clan instead, then later handed over to yet another powerful daimyo, the Imagawa, in whose household he spent much of his youth as a polite, watchful prisoner. He learned patience the hard way, by being completely powerless for years and surviving anyway. When that protecting clan was destroyed at the Battle of Okehazama, the same battle that launched Nobunaga, Ieyasu seized his chance, returned to his ancestral lands, and made himself independent. He then did something shrewd. Rather than fight the rising Nobunaga, he allied with him and stayed loyal to that alliance for 20 years. While Nobunaga conquered the center of the country, Ieyasu steadily expanded his own base in the east, fighting hard campaigns, absorbing defeated rivals, and building a reputation as a commander who was difficult to beat and impossible to rush. After Nobunaga's death, Ieyasu shifted his loyalty, eventually submitting to Hideyoshi rather than fighting a war he might lose. It cost him pride, but preserved his strength. Hideyoshi, recognizing how dangerous Ieyasu was, made him a calculated offer. He would grant Ieyasu an enormous new territory in the Kanto Plain in eastern Japan, far from the capital. On the surface it was a reward. In reality, it was an attempt to move Ieyasu away from the centers of power and tie him up with the work of governing fresh, unfamiliar land. Ieyasu accepted, moved east, and set up his headquarters in a then minor castle town called Edo. That town would one day become Tokyo, one of the largest cities on earth. For now, it was a swampy, undeveloped backwater, and Ieyasu spent years draining marshes, building infrastructure, and turning his exile into the richest, most well-organized domain in the country. So when Hideyoshi died in 1598, leaving a 5-year-old heir and a council of rival regents, Ieyasu held the strongest hand at the table. He commanded the largest territory, the deepest reserves, and the most disciplined administration. He also had decades of practice at waiting for the right moment. He did not have to wait long. The Council of Regents fractured almost immediately into 2 camps. On one side stood the daimyo loyal to the Toyotomi house, and the boy Hideyori, organized around a capable administrator named Ishida Mitsunari. On the other side gathered the daimyo who threw in with Ieyasu. The split was not really about loyalty to a child. It was about who would actually run Japan, and both sides knew it. Through late 1600, the 2 coalitions maneuvered for position, gathering allies, securing castles, and probing for weakness. The country drifted toward a single decisive confrontation. That confrontation came in October of 1600 at a narrow mountain valley called Sekigahara on a misty, rain-soaked morning. 2 enormous armies, together numbering well over 150,000 men, faced each other across the fog. On paper, the Western coalition opposing Ieyasu had a strong position and comparable numbers. But Ieyasu had been doing what he did best, working in the shadows for weeks beforehand, secretly negotiating with commanders on the other side, offering them rewards and guarantees if they would betray their own allies at the critical moment. The battle opened in confusion, the fog so thick that units stumbled into each other almost by accident. For hours it hung in the balance, with hard fighting and no clear advantage. Then Ieyasu gambled. He ordered his gunners to fire on the positions of a Western commander named Tokugawa Hideaki, a young lord who had secretly promised to switch sides, but was hesitating on the hilltop, unsure whether to commit. The volley was a message, a demand that he choose now. Tokugawa chose. He turned his large force against his own allies and charged downhill into their flank. Other secretly bribed commanders followed, refusing to fight or openly defecting. The Western coalition, betrayed from within, collapsed. By the afternoon, the battle was over. Sekigahara was the largest and most important battle in Japanese history, and it was won as much by patient bribery as by force of arms. Ishida Mitsunari was captured and executed. The daimyo who had opposed Ieyasu were stripped of their lands or saw their domains drastically reduced. The vast confiscated territory was redistributed to Ieyasu's loyal allies and family members, a redistribution so sweeping that it reorganized the entire political map of Japan in Ieyasu's favor. He now controlled, directly or through trusted allies, the overwhelming majority of the country's wealth and land. The boy Hideyori still lived in the great fortress of Osaka with a reduced domain, a lingering symbol of the old order, but real power had shifted completely. There is a small detail about Ieyasu that says a great deal about the man. He was famously frugal and obsessive about his health. He compounded his own medicines, studied herbal remedies carefully, and lived to the then remarkable age of 73 in an era when most warlords died, young and violently. He did not win Japan by being the boldest man in the room. He won it by outliving, outlasting, and outthinking everyone else, building the shogunate and crushing the last rival. 3 years after Sekigahara, in 1603, the emperor granted Tokugawa Ieyasu the ancient title of shogun. This was the title Hideyoshi had never been able to claim, and Ieyasu, who carefully cultivated a noble genealogy connecting his family to an old aristocratic lineage, was eligible where the peasant-born Hideyoshi had not been. The title made him the supreme military ruler of Japan, the head of a new government that would be known as the Bakufu, a word that originally meant the tent headquarters of a general in the field. We call it the shogunate. With the capital of this government at Edo, the era it opened is called the Edo period. Ieyasu understood something that his predecessors had not fully grasped. Conquering Japan was one thing. Building a system that would keep the country unified after his death was something else entirely, and far harder. Nobunaga had been murdered before he could finish. Hideyoshi's settlement had collapsed within 2 years of his death. Ieyasu was determined that the Tokugawa would not suffer the same fate, so he moved with deliberate speed to lock the new order into place. His first and most striking move was to step down. Just 2 years after becoming shogun, in 1605, Ieyasu formally resigned the title and passed it to his son, Tokugawa Hidetada. This looked like retirement. It was nothing of the kind. Ieyasu retained all real power, ruling from behind the scenes as a retired shogun, a position with its own name and considerable authority. The point of the maneuver was to demonstrate, beyond any argument, that the office of shogun now belonged to the Tokugawa family by inheritance. It was hereditary. It would pass from father to son. No council of regents, no ambiguity, no opening for a rival to claim the succession. The message to every daimyo in Japan was unmistakable. The Tokugawa were not first among equals. They were a dynasty. But one problem remained, and it sat inside the massive stone walls of Osaka Castle. Toyotomi Hideyori, the son of Hideyoshi, was now a grown man. He still commanded loyalty, wealth, and the prestige of his father's name. As long as he lived, he was a rallying point for anyone unhappy with Tokugawa rule, a living alternative to the new order. Ieyasu, now an old man in his 70s, decided to settle the matter while he still could. The pretext was almost absurdly small. Hideyori had funded the casting of a great temple bell, and the inscription on it included characters that could be read, with enough hostility, as a veiled insult to Ieyasu's name. Ieyasu professed outrage, manufactured a crisis out of the wording, and used it to justify war. In the winter of 1614, Tokugawa armies marched on Osaka Castle, where Hideyori had gathered tens of thousands of masterless samurai, men called ronin, who had lost their lords at Sekigahara and had nothing left to lose. The fortress was immense and brilliantly defended, and the first winter siege failed to break it. So Ieyasu turned again to cunning. He negotiated a truce, and as part of the peace terms, he persuaded the defenders to fill in the castle's outer moats, supposedly as a gesture of goodwill. Once the moats were filled and the great fortress stripped of its outer defenses, Ieyasu broke the truce. In the summer of 1615, he attacked again, and this time the weakened castle could not hold. In the final assault, the defenses were overwhelmed, the keep was set ablaze, and Hideyori, along with his mother, died in the flames. The Toyotomi line was extinguished. The last serious rival to Tokugawa power was gone. The country was now, truly and completely, in Tokugawa hands. Ieyasu did not have long to enjoy his victory. He died the following year, in 1616, at 73. But before he died, he left behind a body of laws and principles meant to guide his heirs and bind the daimyo permanently. The most important of these was a code regulating the conduct of the military houses, which restricted the daimyo in dozens of ways. They were forbidden to repair their castles without permission. They were forbidden to form marriage alliances with one another without the shogunate's approval, since a marriage was also a political alliance and potentially the seed of a rebellion. They were told how to dress, how to behave, and how to manage their domains. Step by step, Ieyasu was converting the wild, independent warlords of the Sengoku era into supervised, controlled subordinates of a central authority. After his death, Ieyasu was deified. He was enshrined as a god, a divine protector of the realm, at a magnificent shrine complex at Nikko, north of Edo. That shrine, gleaming with gold and intricate carving, still stands today, and it announced to the country that the founder of the Tokugawa line was not merely a man who had won a war, he was the sacred guardian of the peace he had built. Hidetada and the tightening grip. When people tell the story of the Tokugawa, they tend to leap from the brilliant founder, Ieyasu, straight to his famous grandson. The man in between, the second shogun, Tokugawa Hidetada, is easy to overlook. That is a mistake. Hidetada took the framework his father had built and bolted it down with a cold, methodical thoroughness that arguably did more to secure the dynasty than any single battle. Hidetada had not been a brilliant battlefield commander. In fact, his great embarrassment was that he had arrived late to Sekigahara, the most important battle of the age, because he had gotten bogged down besieging a stubborn castle along the way and missed the decisive fight entirely. His father was furious, but what Hidetada lacked in military flair, he made up for in administrative ruthlessness. As shogun, and then as a retired shogun ruling behind his own son in the same way his father had ruled behind him, Hidetada spent decades systematically eliminating threats to Tokugawa control. His chief weapon was the power to confiscate domains. Under Hidetada, the shogunate stripped dozens of daimyo of their lands on a wide range of pretexts. A lord who died without a properly designated heir could have his entire domain seized. A lord who broke even minor regulations could be reduced or destroyed. A lord suspected of disloyalty could be transferred to a distant, poorer territory, uprooting his family and breaking his local power base. Over the first decades of Tokugawa rule, an enormous number of domains were eliminated or reassigned in this way. Each confiscation enriched the shogunate, intimidated the survivors, and tightened the central grip another notch. Hidetada also did not hesitate to apply this ruthlessness to his own family. When his own brother-in-law and other close relations stepped out of line or became inconvenient, they too were stripped of power. The lesson was clear to everyone watching. Blood ties to the Tokugawa offered no protection from Tokugawa discipline. Loyalty and obedience were everything. It was under Hidetada that the shogunate's attitude toward Christianity hardened into outright persecution. Christianity had arrived in Japan with the Portuguese and Spanish missionaries in the middle of the 1500s, and it had spread with surprising speed, especially in the southern island of Kyushu, where some local daimyo converted and pushed their subjects to follow. By the early 1600s, there were several 100,000 Japanese Christians. To the Tokugawa, this was deeply alarming. A religion that commanded ultimate loyalty to a foreign god and a foreign pope, spread by Europeans whose intentions were uncertain, looked like a potential channel for subversion and foreign interference. It was a competing source of authority, and the entire Tokugawa project was about making sure there were no competing sources of authority. Ieyasu had already begun restricting the faith. Hidetada escalated sharply, banning Christianity outright and beginning the brutal campaign of suppression that would intensify under his successor. Missionaries were expelled or executed. Japanese converts were ordered to renounce their faith, and those who refused faced torture and death. The persecution grew steadily more systematic and more violent over the following decades. Hidetada also took the first hard steps toward sealing Japan off from the outside world. He tightened controls on foreign trade, restricted the ports where foreign ships could land, and grew increasingly suspicious of European influence in general. The logic that drove this was the same logic that drove everything the early Tokugawa did. Stability required control, and control required eliminating anything the shogunate could not fully supervise. Foreign trade brought wealth, but it also brought guns, missionaries, ideas, and the possibility that a coastal daimyo might grow rich and powerful enough through overseas commerce to challenge Edo. Better to close the doors. When Hidetada died in 1632, the Tokugawa Shogunate was no longer a fresh military victory that might unravel. It was an entrenched, disciplined system of control, with the daimyo cowed, the dangerous religion crushed, and the doors to the outside world swinging shut. He handed all of this to his son, the third shogun, who would take the machine his grandfather designed, and his father bolted down, and run it at full power. Ieyasu, the hostage system, and the closing of Japan. The third shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, is the man who took everything the first two had built and finished it. If Ieyasu was the founder and Hidetada the enforcer, Ieyasu was the architect of the mature system, the version of the shogunate that would run, with adjustments, for the next 200 years. He inherited the title in 1623, and from the start he carried himself differently from his predecessors. Ieyasu had never known the Sengoku Wars personally. He had been born into Tokugawa power, and he intended to make absolutely sure no one ever questioned it. He is said to have summoned the assembled daimyo and reminded them, with blunt clarity, that he was born to rule and they were born to serve, that unlike his father and grandfather, who had once been their peers and rivals, he had been their lord from birth. Whether or not the speech happened exactly that way, the sentiment defined his reign. The daimyo were not partners, they were subjects. Ieyasu's single most important policy, the one that more than any other defined daily life for the ruling class across the entire Edo period, was a system called Sankin Kotai, usually translated as alternate attendance. The rule was simple to state and enormous in its consequences. Every daimyo in Japan was required to maintain a residence in the shogun's capital at Edo and to spend part of his time, typically alternating years, living there in attendance on the shogun. When the daimyo returned to his own domain, he was required to leave his wife and his heir behind in Edo permanently. They lived in the capital as, in effect, honored hostages. Think about what this accomplished. No daimyo could plot a rebellion without knowing that his wife and his eldest son were sitting in Edo, within easy reach of the shogun's executioners. That alone was a powerful deterrent. But the system did much more than hold hostages, moving an entire daimyo household back and forth across the country every year, with hundreds or even thousands of retainers in formal procession, was staggeringly expensive. A great lord might spend a huge portion of his income simply on the travel and on maintaining two grand households, one in his domain and one in Edo. This drained the daimyo of the surplus wealth they might otherwise have spent on armies and ambitions. It kept them poor enough to be safe and busy enough to be distracted. And the side effects rippled through the whole country. The great processions of daimyo traveling to and from Edo turned the highways into bustling arteries of commerce. Inns, post towns, porters, and merchants all flourished along the routes. The constant flow of provincial lords and their retainers into the capital made Edo swell into one of the largest cities in the world, eventually home to over 1 million people. A vast service economy grew up to feed, house, clothe, and entertain them. The hostage system designed to prevent rebellion ended up building the commercial and urban foundation of early modern Japan almost by accident. Ieyasu also completed the policy of national isolation, the set of edicts later known collectively as Sakoku, the closed country. Across the 1630s, a series of orders progressively sealed Japan off. Japanese subjects were forbidden to leave the country, and those already living abroad were forbidden to return, on pain of death. The construction of large ocean-going ships was banned, so that no one could even attempt long-distance voyages. The Portuguese, long suspected of smuggling missionaries, were expelled entirely. Foreign trade was reduced to a tiny, tightly controlled trickle. The Dutch, who were interested in profit rather than conversion, and agreed to keep their religion to themselves, were permitted to maintain a single small trading post. But it was confined to an artificial fan-shaped island in Nagasaki harbor called Dejima, where the handful of Dutch traders lived under close guard and constant supervision. Limited trade also continued with China and Korea through specific controlled channels, but for the most part, the doors of Japan were now shut, and they would stay shut for over 200 years. This closure had its grimmest expression in the suppression of Christianity, which reached its violent climax under Ieyasu. In 1637, in the Shimabara region of Kyushu, a massive uprising broke out. It was driven by a combination of crushing taxation, famine, and the desperation of a heavily Christian peasant population that had been persecuted for years. Tens of thousands of rebels, including many Christians, seized an old castle and held out against the shogunate's forces. The shogunate eventually crushed the rebellion with overwhelming numbers, and the slaughter that followed was nearly total. Tens of thousands of rebels were killed. The Shimabara rebellion confirmed every fear the Tokugawa held about Christianity, and the persecution that followed effectively destroyed the faith as an open religion in Japan. A small number of believers survived in deep secrecy, passing their faith down quietly for generations, the so-called hidden Christians. But in public, Christianity was gone. To make sure it stayed gone, the shogunate instituted a remarkable system of religious surveillance. Every household in Japan was required to register at a Buddhist temple, which then served as proof that the family was not Christian. Officials periodically forced people to demonstrate their rejection of the faith by trampling on images of Christ or the Virgin Mary, bronze plaques called fumie. Refusing to step on the image marked you as a Christian and could cost you your life. The temple registration system, set up to hunt Christians, quietly became a tool of population control, a way for the government to keep track of every subject in the realm. By now, the structure of Tokugawa society had settled into the rigid form it would hold for 2 centuries. And this is the right moment to look closely at how ordinary people actually lived inside it. Society was officially divided into a hierarchy of classes, an idea borrowed from Chinese Confucian thought. At the top stood the samurai, the warrior class, perhaps 6 or 7% of the population. Below them came the peasants, who made up the overwhelming majority and were honored in theory as the producers of the rice that fed the nation, though in practice they were heavily taxed and tightly bound to the land. Below the peasants came artisans, and below the artisans came merchants, ranked last because Confucian thinking despised those who merely moved goods around and profited without producing anything. Outside and beneath the whole system entirely were groups consigned to the most degraded occupations. Those who handled the dead, leather, and butchery, treated as outcasts. The way these classes lived differed enormously. A samurai, in this era of peace, rarely fought. He drew a fixed stipend of rice from his lord, wore 2 swords as the mark of his status, the only people permitted to do so, and increasingly spent his days as an administrator, a clerk, or a guard. His clothing was formal and restrained, a kimono with stiff winged shoulders for official duties, and his life was governed by an elaborate code of honor and etiquette. The diet of a typical samurai was simple, built around rice, fish, pickled vegetables, and miso soup. A wealthy daimyo, of course, lived in great luxury, but ordinary samurai often struggled financially, their fixed rice stipends losing value as the cash economy grew around them. The peasant lived a much harder life. He worked the rice paddies from dawn to dusk, handed over a large share of his harvest in tax, often 40 to 50% or more, and was bound by sumptuary laws that dictated what he could wear and eat. Peasants were officially forbidden silk and were expected to wear simple cotton or hemp clothing in muted colors. Their diet leaned heavily on millet, barley, and other coarse grains, because much of the precious white rice they grew went to taxes and to feed the cities. They lived in villages that were largely self-governing, responsible collectively for their tax payments, with village headmen handling the paperwork between the community and the lord's officials. The merchant, ranked lowest of the respectable classes, often ended up the richest. As the long peace turned Japan into a commercial society, the merchants of cities like Osaka and Edo accumulated enormous wealth, handling rice, lending money, and trading goods. They were officially despised and legally restricted, forbidden from flaunting their wealth too openly. But their money increasingly made the whole society run, and the impoverished samurai class found itself perpetually in debt to the merchants it looked down on. That contradiction, a warrior elite slowly going broke, while a merchant class it scorned grew rich, would gnaw at the foundations of Tokugawa society for the rest of its existence. When Ieyasu died in 1651, the system was complete. The daimyo were controlled by the hostage rotation. The country was sealed. The dangerous religion was crushed. Society was frozen into its ranks. The machine Ieyasu had imagined was now fully built and running. The question that would define the next 2 centuries was no longer how to win Japan or how to hold it. It was what happens to a nation of warriors when there are no more wars to fight. The roads and the great city, the hostage system, and the long peace did something to Japan that no shogun had planned for. They built a country knit together by roads and dominated by a single enormous city, and that physical transformation of the landscape is as much a part of the Tokugawa story as any shogun or battle. To understand how 30 million people actually lived under this regime, you have to look at the roads they traveled and the cities they crowded into. At the heart of the network were 5 great highways radiating out from Edo, the most famous of which ran along the Pacific coast, connecting Edo to the old imperial capital at Kyoto. This was the Tokaido, the Eastern Sea Road, and it became the busiest highway in the country. The shogunate maintained these roads carefully because the entire alternate attendance system depended on them. Along their length, at regular intervals, stood post stations, official rest towns where travelers could change horses, hire porters, find lodging, eat, and rest. There were dozens of these post stations along the Tokaido alone, and they grew into thriving little towns. Their economies built entirely on the endless stream of traffic. The shogunate watched these roads with great care, because controlling movement was central to controlling the country. At key points along the highways stood barrier checkpoints, where officials inspected travelers and their documents. The 2 things the inspectors watched for most closely were captured in a grim phrase of the era: guns coming in and women going out. Weapons being smuggled into Edo might mean a plot. Women leaving Edo might mean the wife or daughter of a daimyo trying to escape the hostage system and flee back to her home domain, a sign that her lord might be preparing to rebel. A woman traveling the highways needed proper documentation, and the checkpoints scrutinized female travelers with particular suspicion. The roads were arteries of commerce, but they were also instruments of surveillance. Travel along these roads became, over time, something close to a national pastime, at least for those who could manage it. Although ordinary people needed permits and faced restrictions, religious pilgrimage offered an accepted reason to travel, and great numbers of commoners set out on pilgrimages to famous shrines and temples, combining genuine devotion with what amounted to tourism. Guidebooks were published describing the sites, the local specialties, and the famous views along the major routes. A whole genre of art and literature grew up around travel, celebrating the landscapes, the post towns, and the experience of the journey itself. The roads that had been built to control the daimyo ended up giving ordinary Japanese a shared sense of their own country, its geography, its famous places, and its regional flavors. At the center of it all sat Edo, which grew over the 17th century into one of the largest cities anywhere on Earth, eventually home to well over 1 million people. This was an astonishing thing, a city of more than 1 million in a country that had been a patchwork of warring provinces only a century before. Roughly half the population was made up of samurai, the daimyo and their retainers compelled to spend so much of their lives there by the attendance system, along with the shogunate's own enormous body of direct vassals. The other half were the commoners, the merchants, artisans, laborers, and servants who fed, clothed, housed, and served this vast warrior population. The samurai half occupied the spacious districts around the castle. The commoner half was packed into dense, crowded, low-lying neighborhoods, living at some of the highest population densities in the pre-modern world. That density, combined with a city built largely of wood and paper, made fire the great terror of Edo life. The city burned again and again throughout its history, sometimes catastrophically. One enormous fire in the middle of the 17th century destroyed much of the city, including the main keep of Edo Castle, and killed an appalling number of people, possibly over 100,000. Fires were so frequent and so much a part of the city's character that Edoites developed a famous dark saying that fires and brawls were the flowers of Edo, a bitter joke about the things their city produced in abundance. The shogunate organized firefighting brigades, built fire breaks, and constantly rebuilt, and the constant cycle of destruction and reconstruction became a permanent feature of the city's economy and identity. The great keep of the castle, once it burned, was never even rebuilt. Edo was not the only great city. The old imperial capital of Kyoto remained the cultural and religious heart of the country, home to the emperor and his court, to countless temples and shrines, and to the finest traditional crafts, especially textiles and refined handiwork. Osaka, meanwhile, became the commercial capital, the great center of trade and finance, where the rice from domains all across western Japan was shipped, stored, bought, and sold. Osaka was the nation's kitchen and its marketplace, a city run by and for merchants, where the prices that governed the whole economy were effectively set. Beyond these giants, every domain had its own castle town, the seat of the local daimyo, where his samurai retainers were gathered and the local administration and commerce concentrated. This deliberate gathering of all the samurai into the castle towns, pulling them off the land and into urban centers, was itself a tool of control, separating the warrior class from the peasantry and making them dependent on stipends rather than on land they held directly. The result of all this was a country far more urbanized, far more commercially integrated, and far more connected than it had ever been before. Goods, money, people, and ideas flowed along the highways and through the great cities in volumes that the founders of the regime could never have imagined. The Tokugawa had set out to freeze Japan into a stable, controlled, agricultural order. What they actually created, as a side effect of their controls, was the foundation of a dynamic urban commercial society, the very thing their rigid system was least equipped to handle. The roads in the cities were the regime's great unintended achievement, and also, in the long run, one of the forces that would help render its frozen structure obsolete, a warrior class without a war. The death of Ieyasu in 1651 produced the first real test of the system. His heir, the fourth shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was a sickly boy of only 10 years old. In the Sengoku era, a 10-year-old ruler would have been an irresistible invitation to rebellion. The fact that the Tokugawa survived this vulnerable moment with barely a tremor is the clearest possible proof that the system had taken hold. Power no longer rested on the personal strength of the shogun. It rested on the institution itself, run by a council of senior officials who governed competently in the boy's name. There was, however, one frightening moment. Shortly after Ieyasu's death, a plot was uncovered. A military scholar and a group of disgruntled ronin, masterless samurai, conspired to set fire to Edo and seize power amid the chaos. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out, and its leaders were executed. But it pointed at a real and growing problem. The long peace and the steady confiscation of domains had thrown enormous numbers of samurai out of work. When a lord lost his domain, all his retainers lost their livelihoods at once, becoming ronin with military training, a strong sense of grievance, and no legitimate place in the new order. By the middle of the 1600s, there were huge numbers of these masterless warriors drifting through the cities, and they were a genuine source of instability. The shogunate responded with a telling change of approach. Rather than continuing to confiscate domains aggressively, which only created more ronin, it relaxed the harshest rules. The old practice of seizing a domain whenever a lord died without a designated heir was softened, allowing dying lords to adopt an heir at the last minute and preserve their house. This single adjustment dramatically reduced the number of new ronin being created, and it signaled a profound shift in the character of the regime. The early Tokugawa had governed by intimidation and confiscation, the methods of conquerors. The mature Tokugawa began to govern by stability and continuity, the methods of administrators. The age of conquest was giving way to the age of management. This shift had a deep effect on the samurai themselves. The samurai had been created as a class of fighters. Their entire identity, their privileges, their swords, their honor code, all of it rested on the assumption that they were warriors. But there were no more wars. A samurai might go his entire life, his father's entire life, and his grandfather's entire life without ever drawing a blade in anger. So what was a warrior class for, in a country at perfect peace? The answer that emerged over the second half of the 17th century was a remarkable transformation. The samurai gradually became a class of bureaucrats, scholars, and administrators. They ran the domains. They staffed the offices of the shogunate. They collected taxes, managed finances, settled disputes, and kept records. The skills that mattered shifted from swordsmanship to literacy, from archery to accounting. A samurai still wore his two swords and still cultivated the martial spirit in theory, practicing fencing in training halls. But in practice, his weapon was the writing brush. This was also the period when the famous warrior ethic was codified, in a sense, precisely because the reality of warfare had vanished. With no battles to fight, samurai and scholars began to write about what it meant to be a warrior, to systematize the values of loyalty, honor, frugality, and self-discipline into a formal code. The romantic image of the noble samurai devoted unto death to his lord was, to a significant degree, a creation of this peaceful era, an idealization written down by men who had never seen combat, looking back at a violent past that had already become legend. The most famous text in this tradition, a meditation on the warrior's readiness to die, was composed by a retired retainer in the early 1700s, generations after the last great battles. Here is a detail that captures the strangeness of the situation. By the height of the Edo period, many samurai had become so unaccustomed to actual violence that swordsmanship survived mostly as a refined art and a sport, practiced with wooden or bamboo swords in training halls, more akin to a discipline of character than a preparation for war. Some samurai families pawned their real swords to pay their debts and carried cheap substitutes, the blade itself becoming a financial liability rather than a tool of battle. Underneath all of this ran an economic transformation that the rigid class system was poorly equipped to handle. The samurai were paid in fixed stipends of rice, but the economy was rapidly becoming a cash economy, increasingly driven by money, credit, and trade, rather than by rice. As merchants grew rich and prices fluctuated, the samurai, with their fixed incomes, found themselves squeezed. They had high status and shrinking purchasing power. Many fell into debt to merchant moneylenders, the very people the social hierarchy placed beneath them. A proud warrior elite was slowly becoming an indebted salaried class, and the contradiction between their exalted rank and their declining material reality would only deepen as the decades passed. The reign of the fourth shogun, Ieyasu, is not remembered for dramatic events. He was often ill and left much of the governing to his officials, but the very uneventfulness of his rule is the point. Under him, the shogunate completed its transition from a war regime to a peace regime, from a government of conquering generals to a government of professional administrators. The stage was set for the first great flowering of the culture that this long peace made possible, and that flowering would come under one of the strangest shoguns the Tokugawa ever produced, the Dog Shogun and the Genroku boom. When the fourth shogun, Ieyasu, died in 1680 without a son, the succession passed to his younger brother, Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, who became the fifth shogun. Tsunayoshi is one of the most colorful, controversial, and frequently mocked rulers in the entire Tokugawa line, remembered by a nickname that says it all. He is called the Dog Shogun. He earned the name through one of the most peculiar set of laws in Japanese history, the so-called Edicts on Compassion for Living Things. Tsunayoshi, a devout Buddhist, became increasingly obsessed with the prohibition against taking life. Some accounts say he was influenced by advisors who told him that, having been born in the year of the dog, he had a special duty to protect animals, particularly dogs, and that doing so might help him gain a male heir, which he desperately lacked. Whatever the cause, he issued a sweeping and ever-expanding body of laws protecting animals. Killing a dog could be punished with death. Stray dogs in Edo multiplied enormously under government protection, and the shogunate eventually had to build vast kennels on the outskirts of the city to house tens of thousands of strays, fed and cared for at considerable public expense. People were expected to address dogs with terms of respect. The laws extended to other animals as well, restricting fishing, hunting, and the treatment of horses, birds, and even insects. These edicts were widely resented. They imposed real hardships, criminalized ordinary livelihoods, and struck many people as the absurd whims of an eccentric ruler. And yet there is another way to read them. They were part of a broader effort, characteristic of Tsuneyoshi's reign, to shift the moral tone of the country away from the casual brutality of the warrior past and toward an ethic of compassion, learning, and civility. Tsuneyoshi was a serious patron of scholarship and Confucian learning. He promoted education, lectured on the classics himself, and tried to govern as a cultivated Confucian sage rather than a mere warlord. The animal edicts, however ridiculous in execution, were of a piece with this attempt to civilize and refine a society that had been forged in war. Whatever one makes of the dog shogun, his reign coincided with the first great cultural golden age of the Edo period, a flourishing so vivid that it gave its name to the era. It is called Genroku, after the calendar period that ran from 1688 to 1704, and it represents the moment when the long peace finally produced a rich, confident, distinctly urban culture, driven not by the samurai elite, but by the wealthy merchants and townspeople of the great cities. This was the world of the floating world, the ukiyo, the pleasure districts of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, where merchants spent their money on entertainment, fashion, theater, and art. It produced kabuki theater, with its spectacular staging, dramatic poses, and star actors who were the celebrities of their day. It produced the puppet theater, bunraku, with its elaborately manipulated figures performing tragedies and love stories. It produced the woodblock print, the ukiyo-e, mass-produced images of beautiful courtesans, famous actors, and scenes of city life that ordinary townspeople could afford to buy. It produced a literature of the merchant class, witty, worldly stories of love affairs, money, and the pleasures and follies of urban life, written by authors who wrote for a paying public rather than for noble patrons. And it produced a refinement of poetry that compressed entire moods and seasons into a handful of syllables, perfected by a wandering poet who turned brief verse into one of the supreme art forms of the language. The most striking thing about Genroku culture is who created it. It was driven largely by the class that the official hierarchy ranked at the very bottom, the merchants. Forbidden by law from displaying their wealth through political power or extravagant estates, they poured their money instead into pleasure, art, and style. The result was a culture of taste, fashion, and aesthetic sophistication that the supposedly superior samurai class often could not afford to match. The bottom of the official ladder had become the engine of the nation's cultural life. But the Genroku boom rested on shaky financial ground, and Tsuneyoshi's government found itself in deepening money trouble. Lavish spending, expensive construction projects, the costs of the animal kennels, and a great fire that devastated much of Edo all strained the treasury. To cover the shortfall, the government did something that would have lasting consequences. It debased the currency, recalling the gold and silver coins and reissuing them with less precious metal, keeping the difference for itself. This was, in effect, a way of printing money, and it produced the predictable result. Prices rose, the coinage lost trust, and inflation began to eat into the economy. The financial troubles of the shogunate, which would recur again and again over the coming centuries, had begun in earnest. When Tsuneyoshi died in 1709, having failed to produce a surviving heir despite everything, he left behind a country culturally richer than it had ever been, and financially shakier than it had been in decades. He also left behind, almost immediately, the most famous story in all of Tokugawa history, a story that had unfolded during his reign and that captured the deepest tensions of the entire age. It is the story of the 47 Ronin. The 47 Ronin. In the spring of 1701, an incident took place inside Edo Castle that would become the single most retold, most dramatized, and most beloved story in Japanese history. It is known as the Akko incident, and it is the story of the 47 Ronin. It matters not only because it is dramatic, but because it exposed, in the sharpest possible way, the central contradiction at the heart of the Tokugawa order, the conflict between the old warrior code of personal loyalty and revenge, and the new state's absolute demand for obedience to the law. The incident began with a relatively minor figure, a young provincial lord named Asano Naganori, who had been assigned to help host an important ceremony at Edo Castle. The official responsible for instructing the lords in the complex etiquette of the occasion was a high-ranking shogunate official named Kira Yoshinaka. Accounts of exactly what happened between them vary, but the traditional version holds that Kira was arrogant, insulting, and possibly corrupt, and that he humiliated and provoked the young Asano past his breaking point. Whatever the precise cause, Asano drew his short sword inside the castle and attacked Kira, wounding him. Drawing a weapon and shedding blood within the precincts of Edo Castle was an extremely grave offense, regardless of provocation. The shogunate's response was swift and harsh. Asano was ordered to commit ritual suicide, seppuku, that very same day. His domain was confiscated, and his retainers were dispossessed, scattered, and turned into ronin, masterless samurai. Crucially, Kira, the other party to the quarrel, was not punished at all. To Asano's loyal retainers, this was a profound injustice. By the old warrior code, the death of their lord cried out for vengeance against the man who had caused it. 47 of Asano's former retainers, led by his chief retainer, Oishi Kuranosuke, secretly resolved to avenge their lord by killing Kira. But they understood that Kira and the authorities would be watching for exactly such a move. So they waited. For nearly 2 years, they dispersed and pretended to abandon all thought of revenge. Oishi himself went to Kyoto and openly took up a life of drunkenness and dissipation, frequenting pleasure houses and behaving so disgracefully that observers concluded he was a broken man with no honor left. It was all a careful performance, designed to convince Kira that there was no danger and to make him drop his guard. It worked. In the dead of a snowy winter night, late in 1702, the 47 Ronin gathered, armed themselves, and attacked Kira's mansion in Edo in a coordinated assault. They overcame his guards, searched the compound, and found Kira hiding. They killed him, took his head, and then marched in procession across the city to the temple where their lord Asano was buried, where they laid Kira's severed head upon his grave. Their revenge was complete. Then they turned themselves in to the authorities and waited for judgment. This put the shogunate in an agonizing position, and the debate over what to do with the 47 Ronin went to the highest levels of government. On one hand, the Ronin had behaved as the ideal of the loyal samurai demanded. They had sacrificed everything, including their own lives, to avenge their lord. By the values that the entire warrior class supposedly held sacred, they were heroes, models of perfect loyalty. The public adored them. On the other hand, they had carried out a premeditated act of murder and vendetta, taken the law into their own hands, and defied the absolute authority of the state. If the shogunate let them go free, it would be endorsing private vengeance over public law, which struck directly at the foundation of the peace the Tokugawa had built. The whole point of the system was that no one took up arms without the state's sanction. The shogunate found a compromise that tried to honor both principles. The 47 Ronin were condemned to death, as the law required, but they were permitted to die honorably by ritual suicide rather than being executed as common criminals. They committed seppuku and were buried alongside their lord, where their graves remain a site of pilgrimage to this day. The state had upheld the law, but it had also acknowledged, through the manner of their death, the genuine nobility of their loyalty. The story exploded into legend almost immediately. It was dramatized for the stage within weeks, and it has been retold in countless plays, prints, novels, and films ever since, becoming the defining national tale of samurai loyalty. But notice what the story actually reveals. It became the great romantic legend of the warrior spirit precisely at the moment when that spirit had become impractical and even dangerous in the real world. The 47 Ronin were celebrated as the perfect samurai, and yet the perfect samurai, acting on the perfect code, had to be put to death by the very state the samurai class served. The Age of Peace adored the warrior ideal exactly because it could no longer afford to let anyone actually live by it. The scholar, at the shogun's side, the death of the dog shogun in 1709, with no heir of his own, brought a nephew to power as the sixth shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu. His reign was short, only a few years, and the reign of his young son after him, the seventh shogun, Ieyasu, was shorter still, ending when the boy died at the age of 7. But this brief stretch of fragile, short-lived shoguns is important for one reason. It was the period when real power lay not with the shogun at all, but with a brilliant Confucian scholar who served as the chief advisor to the throne, a man named Arai Hakuseki. Arai Hakuseki represents something new in Tokugawa government. He was not a great daimyo or a hereditary military man. He was an intellectual, a scholar of history, language, and economics, who rose to influence purely through learning and ability. His career shows how completely the regime had transformed. A century earlier, power had belonged to whoever could win battles. Now, it could belong to a man whose only weapon was his mind. Arai Hakuseki advised the 6th and 7th shoguns on policy, and he tried to bring order, rationality, and Confucian principle to a government drifting into financial confusion. His central concern was the currency. He understood, more clearly than most, the damage that Tsunayoshi's debasement of the coinage had done. By reducing the precious metal content of the coins, the previous government had triggered inflation and undermined trust in money itself. Arai Hakuseki pushed to reverse this, to restore the coinage to its old, higher quality, recalling the debased coins and reissuing trustworthy ones. His intentions were sound, but the execution caused its own problems. Sharply restoring the value of the currency contracted the money supply and caused painful deflation and economic disruption, hurting the very commerce it was meant to protect. The episode taught a lesson that the shogunate would keep relearning. The economy of Edo Japan had grown into a complex commercial system that did not respond neatly to moral principle or simple decrees. Arai Hakuseki also tried to reform the shogunate's relations with the outside world, particularly the costly and increasingly hollow diplomatic exchanges with Korea, and to assert the dignity and authority of the shogun in dealings with foreign envoys. He had an unusually wide and curious mind, and he is notable for interrogating a captured Italian missionary who had managed to slip into Japan in violation of the ban. From these conversations, Arai Hakuseki compiled detailed, surprisingly accurate notes on the geography, religions, and politics of the wider world, a rare window into Europe at a time when such knowledge was forbidden. He was no friend of Christianity, but he was deeply interested in understanding the foreigners, and he argued for treating the captured missionary with relative leniency rather than torture, on rational rather than sentimental grounds. When the boy shogun Ieyasu died in 1716, the direct main line of descent from Ieyasu's son Hidetada finally ran out. There was no son to inherit. This was the moment for which Ieyasu had, with characteristic foresight, prepared. Generations earlier, the founder had established 3 branch families of the Tokugawa house, Collateral lines descended from his other sons, whose entire purpose was to provide an heir to the shogunate if the main line ever failed. Now that contingency had arrived. The succession passed to the head of one of these branch houses, the lord of the key domain. With his accession as the 8th shogun, the era of fragile, short-lived rulers ended, and Arai Hakuseki's influence ended with it. The new shogun was a man of enormous energy and ability, and he would dominate the first half of the 18th century. His name was Tokugawa Yoshimune. Yoshimune and the Great Reforms. Tokugawa Yoshimune, the 8th shogun, is widely regarded as the greatest of all the Tokugawa rulers after the founder himself. He came to power in 1716 from a branch family, not from the main line, which gave him a certain outsider's energy and a willingness to shake up a government that had grown comfortable and complacent. He ruled for nearly 30 years, and his program of reform, known as the Kyoho reforms after the calendar era, set the pattern for how the shogunate would try to fix itself for the rest of its existence. The core problem Yoshimune faced was money. The shogunate was chronically short of funds. Its income came mainly from the rice produced on its own lands, but its expenses had grown relentlessly, and the gap between the two kept widening. Yoshimune attacked this problem from every direction with a discipline that bordered on obsession. He was famous for his personal frugality, dressing in plain cotton rather than silk, cutting back on luxuries in the shogun's own household, and demanding austerity from everyone around him. He believed, in true Confucian fashion, that the ruler had to model the virtue he wanted to see in his people, and that the path back to fiscal health ran through thrift and discipline. But Yoshimune was far more than a budget cutter. He was a genuine reformer with a practical, almost scientific cast of mind. He promoted the reclamation of new rice fields to expand the agricultural base. He reformed the tax system, shifting toward fixed assessments that gave the government more predictable income. He temporarily required the daimyo to contribute extra rice to the shogunate in exchange for reducing their time spent in costly attendance at Edo, a clever short-term measure to refill the treasury. He reorganized the administration and promoted capable officials based on talent rather than purely on rank, even creating a stipend system that allowed able men of lower status to hold higher offices. Two of his reforms stand out for their lasting significance. The first was a new legal code, a systematic compilation of laws and precedents that gave the shogunate's officials a clear, rational basis for justice rather than relying on arbitrary precedent and the whim of individual administrators. The second was a remarkable innovation in governance. Yoshimune set up a complaint box, a literal box placed where ordinary subjects could deposit written petitions and grievances directly to the shogunate, bypassing the layers of officials who might otherwise filter or suppress them. Some real reforms came out of this, including, according to tradition, the establishment of a public hospital for the poor in Edo. It was a striking gesture from an absolute ruler, an acknowledgement that the government needed to hear from the governed, perhaps the most consequential of all Yoshimune's decisions. In the long run, concerned knowledge from the outside world. The blanket ban on foreign books, imposed during the anti-Christian purges, had cut Japan off from the rapid advances in European science and medicine. Yoshimune, with his practical curiosity, recognized that this was costing Japan something valuable. He relaxed the ban, permitting the import of European books as long as they did not promote Christianity. This single decision cracked open a door that had been sealed for a century. Through that crack would flow a steady stream of Western learning, especially in medicine, astronomy, and the natural sciences, transmitted through the Dutch traders at Nagasaki. This body of knowledge became known as Dutch learning, and it would grow into one of the most important intellectual currents of the late Edo period, with consequences neither Yoshimune nor anyone else could have foreseen. Yoshimune's reforms genuinely improved the shogunate's finances and stabilized the regime for a time, but they did not solve the underlying problem, because the underlying problem was structural and could not be fixed by frugality alone. The shogunate's wealth was based on rice, on agriculture, on a fixed and largely static foundation. The real economy, meanwhile, was becoming ever more commercial, monetary, and dynamic, growing in ways the rice-based system could not capture or tax effectively. Yoshimune could squeeze more efficiency out of the old system, but he could not change the fact that the old system was being outgrown by the society around it. Every shogun and every reformer who came after him would wrestle with the same contradiction, and none of them would ever truly resolve it. When Yoshimune stepped down and eventually died in the middle of the century, he left behind a healthier treasury and a model of reform, but also the same fundamental problem he had inherited, merely postponed: the life of the mind in a closed country. It would be easy to imagine that a country sealed off from the world, with a frozen class system and a censorship-minded government, must have been a stagnant place intellectually. The opposite was true. The long Tokugawa peace, combined with rising prosperity and the spread of education, produced one of the most vibrant intellectual cultures in Japanese history. This is the right moment to step back from the parade of shoguns and look at the world of ideas that was developing beneath them, because that world would eventually help bring the whole shogunate down. Start with literacy, which spread to a remarkable degree. By the later Edo period, Japan had one of the highest literacy rates in the pre-modern world. Samurai children were educated in domain schools that taught the Confucian classics, history, and ethics. Commoner children, including many in towns and even villages, attended small private schools where they learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, often using practical textbooks geared toward the needs of merchants and farmers. A society that could read was a society that could be reached by books, by ideas, and eventually by political argument. And the Tokugawa had, without quite intending to, created exactly such a society. The official ideology of the regime was a particular school of Confucian thought, which emphasized hierarchy, loyalty, and the harmony of a well-ordered society in which everyone knew and kept their proper place. This was enormously convenient for a government built on rigid class distinctions, and the shogunate promoted it as the philosophical foundation of the social order. But ideas, once they spread, are difficult to control, and Confucian learning produced unexpected offshoots. Some scholars used Confucian rationalism to question received wisdom and examine the world critically. Others turned the tools of scholarship in a more dangerous direction. That dangerous direction was a movement known as national learning, an intellectual current that turned away from Chinese Confucian thought and sought instead to recover what its scholars believed was the authentic, ancient, native spirit of Japan. These scholars studied the oldest Japanese texts, the early poetry, myths, and chronicles, looking for a purely Japanese identity that predated the heavy influence of Chinese civilization. On the surface, this was a literary and philological project, but it carried a political charge that would prove explosive. By exalting Japan's ancient native traditions, and by focusing attention on the figure at the center of those traditions, the emperor, national learning quietly raised a question that the entire Tokugawa system depended on no one asking. If the emperor was the true, divine, ancient sovereign of Japan, then what, exactly, was the shogun? The shogun, after all, was only a military deputy who supposedly ruled on the emperor's behalf. For 2 centuries, the emperor had been a powerless figurehead kept in genteel poverty in Kyoto, while the Tokugawa ruled in fact. National learning, by reviving reverence for the imperial line, planted a seed of doubt about the legitimacy of shogunal rule itself. Alongside this ran the other great current, Dutch learning, the study of Western science and knowledge that Yoshimune's relaxation of the book ban had made possible. Through the narrow channel of the Dutch trading post at Nagasaki, Japanese scholars gained access to European works on anatomy, medicine, astronomy, geography, physics, and mechanics. The impact of this was profound and sometimes shocking. In one famous episode, a group of Japanese physicians obtained a Dutch anatomy textbook and attended the dissection of an executed criminal. They were astonished to find that the detailed European diagrams matched the actual human body far more accurately than the traditional Chinese medical texts they had relied on. The experience convinced them that Western knowledge in these areas was simply superior, and they undertook the enormous labor of translating the Dutch anatomy text into Japanese, despite barely knowing the language, working out the meaning word by painful word. Their translation became a landmark, and it inspired a generation of scholars to pursue Western learning seriously. This Dutch learning was double-edged for the shogunate. On one hand, it brought genuinely useful knowledge in medicine, in surveying and map-making, in astronomy and calendar reform that the government itself sometimes sponsored and used. On the other hand, it gradually exposed educated Japanese to the reality that the outside world, far from being barbaric and irrelevant, was advancing rapidly in science and technology, while Japan stood still behind its closed doors. The more Japanese scholars learned about European achievements, the more some of them began to wonder whether isolation was really protecting Japan or simply leaving it dangerously behind. These were uncomfortable thoughts, and the government grew increasingly nervous about Dutch learning as the years passed, periodically cracking down on scholars whose interest in the West shaded into criticism of national policy. Taken together, these intellectual currents meant that beneath the surface calm of the late Tokugawa order, a great deal was stirring. A literate population was absorbing new ideas. Some scholars were quietly questioning the legitimacy of shogunal rule by exalting the emperor. Others were absorbing a growing awareness that the closed country was falling behind a rapidly changing world. None of this yet threatened the regime directly. But the intellectual ground was shifting, and when the external shock finally came in the middle of the 19th century, these ideas would be there, ready to be turned into a movement that would topple the shogunate. The Tokugawa had built a prison of stability, and inside it, minds had kept moving. The merchant's friend and the backlash. By the second half of the 18th century, the contradiction at the heart of the Tokugawa economy had become impossible to ignore. The government's wealth was tied to rice and agriculture, but the real growth and the real money were in commerce, trade, and finance. Successive reformers had tried to solve the shogunate's chronic deficits by squeezing the old agricultural system harder. Then, for a brief and remarkable period, a single official tried the opposite approach. Rather than fighting the rise of commerce, he tried to harness it. His name was Tanuma Okitsugu, and he is one of the most fascinating and divisive figures of the late Edo period. Tanuma rose to become the dominant figure in the government during the reign of the 10th shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, in the 1760s and 1770s. He came from relatively modest origins and climbed through ability and political skill, which already made him an object of suspicion among the higher born. What set Tanuma apart was his economic thinking. He grasped that the commercial economy was where the wealth now lay, and he set out to tap it directly for the benefit of the shogunate. He encouraged and licensed merchant guilds and monopolies, allowing them exclusive rights to certain trades in exchange for fees and taxes paid to the government. He promoted the development of mining, the reclamation of land, and new commercial ventures. He even showed interest in expanding foreign trade and exploring the northern frontier of Hokkaido and beyond, looking outward in a way that ran against the grain of the closed country. In economic terms, Tanuma's approach was arguably the most realistic the shogunate ever attempted. He understood the actual economy of his time and tried to govern it as it really was, rather than as Confucian theory said it ought to be. But his methods made him deeply unpopular among the traditional samurai elite, and for reasons that reveal a great deal about the values of the age. By working so closely with merchants, and by relying on licensing fees and what amounted to commercial deal-making, Tanuma blurred the sacred line between the honorable warrior class and the despised merchant class. His system was widely seen as riddled with corruption, with officials taking bribes and favors from the merchants they regulated. Whether Tanuma himself was genuinely corrupt or simply the victim of his enemies' propaganda is still debated, but the perception was devastating. To the moralists of the samurai class, he represented everything that was going wrong: a government in bed with merchants, virtue abandoned for profit, the natural order turned upside down. Tanuma's position depended heavily on the favor of the shogun Ieyasu. A series of disasters undermined him. A catastrophic famine struck in the 1780s, one of the worst in the entire Edo period, triggered by crop failures and a massive volcanic eruption that darkened skies and ruined harvests. Hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation and the diseases that follow famine. Rice prices soared, riots broke out in the cities, and desperate peasants rose up in the countryside. To Tanuma's critics, the famine was proof that his immoral, commercialized government had angered heaven and brought catastrophe upon the realm. When the shogun Ieyasu died in 1786, Tanuma's protection vanished, and his enemies moved swiftly. He was driven from office, stripped of much of his property, and disgraced. His commercial experiment was over. What replaced it was a sharp swing back toward austerity and moral rigor, led by a man who was Tanuma's opposite in every way. With the accession of the 11th shogun, the young Tokugawa Ieyasu, real power passed to a senior official named Matsudaira Sadanobu, a high-born grandson of the great reformer Yoshimune. Sadanobu launched a new round of reforms, the Kansei reforms, explicitly modeled on his grandfather's earlier program and aimed at undoing everything Tanuma had done. He attacked corruption, slashed spending, and demanded a return to frugality and Confucian virtue. He canceled samurai debts to merchant moneylenders, providing temporary relief to the indebted warrior class at the expense of the merchants. He tried to force peasants who had drifted into the cities back to their farms to shore up the agricultural base. He established a relief granary system to store rice against future famines. And he imposed strict moral and intellectual discipline, censoring publications, cracking down on the pleasure quarters, and banning the teaching of Confucian doctrines that deviated from the official orthodoxy. Sadanobu's reforms restored a measure of order and fiscal discipline, but they were harsh, puritanical, and widely resented for their severity. They suppressed the lively commercial and cultural energy that had made the cities vibrant, and they could not, any more than Yoshimune's reforms had, escape the basic contradiction of trying to run a commercial society on agricultural principles. Sadanobu lasted only a few years in power before he too fell from favor and was forced out. But the pattern was now fully established, and it would repeat one final time. The shogunate would drift into financial trouble and moral laxity. A stern reformer would impose austerity and try to turn back the clock. The reforms would fail to address the root problem, and the cycle would begin again. Each turn of the cycle left the regime a little weaker and the contradictions a little sharper. The long rain and the gathering storm. The 11th shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, holds a record that no other Tokugawa came close to matching. He ruled for around half a century, the longest reign of any shogun, stretching from the 1780s into the 1830s. And his reign demonstrates, more clearly than any other, the slow rot that had set into the regime. After the stern reformer Matsudaira Sadanobu was pushed out, Ieyasu shrugged off the austerity that had been imposed in his name and settled into a long, comfortable, and famously extravagant rule. Inari is remembered above all for the staggering scale of his personal indulgence. He maintained an enormous household with a vast number of concubines, and he fathered an extraordinary number of children, more than 50 by various accounts, many of whom he then placed in marriages with daimyo families across the country, partly as a way of binding those families to the shogunate, and partly simply to provide for his sprawling offspring. The cost of this lifestyle was immense, and it set the tone for a court culture of luxury and self-indulgence at the very top of the government. The disciplined frugality that Yoshimune and Sadanobu had preached was abandoned, and spending ran wild. The deeper problem was not merely Ienari's personal extravagance, however striking it was. It was that the long reign coincided with a period in which all of the regime's chronic weaknesses came to a head at once. The financial troubles deepened. The samurai class sank further into debt and impoverishment, their fixed rice stipends buying less and less in an inflating economy. The currency was debased yet again to cover government shortfalls, feeding inflation. The gap between the official agricultural foundation of the state and the real commercial economy yawned wider than ever. And the countryside grew increasingly unstable, with rising numbers of peasant protests and uprisings against high taxes, hoarding, and hardship. Then nature struck a devastating blow. In the 1830s, a series of catastrophic harvest failures produced the Tempo famine, one of the great famines of Japanese history. Cold weather, crop failures, and flooding ruined harvests across large parts of the country for several years running. Rice prices soared beyond the reach of the poor. People starved in enormous numbers, in the countryside and increasingly in the cities, where the bodies of the dead lay in the streets. The famine exposed the failures of government at every level, as officials and merchants were widely accused of hoarding rice and profiteering while ordinary people died. Peasant uprisings multiplied. The social order that the Tokugawa had frozen in place 2 centuries earlier was straining against pressures it had never been designed to withstand. It was against this background of famine, corruption, and suffering that one of the most shocking events of the late Edo period took place, an event that struck at the very heart of the regime's legitimacy. It happened in the great commercial city of Osaka, and it was led not by a desperate peasant or a masterless ronin, but by a respected official and scholar, a man who was supposed to be a pillar of the order he turned against. The floating world in full bloom. The early 1800s, the decades of the 11th shogun's long and indulgent reign, saw something unexpected blossom across Japan even as the government drifted into decline. While the regime stagnated at the top, the popular culture of the cities reached a height of richness and sophistication that has shaped the world's image of old Japan ever since. The Genroku era a century earlier had given birth to this urban culture. Now, in the early 19th century, it ripened into full maturity, and it is worth lingering on because it represents the most lasting and beloved legacy of the entire Tokugawa age. At the center of this culture stood the woodblock print, the ukiyo-e, the pictures of the floating world. By this period, the technique had been perfected, with prints made in many colors through the careful registration of multiple carved blocks, each adding one color to the image. These prints were not precious objects for the elite. They were mass-produced, affordable, and bought by ordinary townspeople, the popular media of their day. Early prints had focused on the subjects of the pleasure quarters, the beautiful courtesans, and the celebrated kabuki actors who were the stars of urban entertainment. But in this late flowering, the art expanded into new subjects that would become world famous. 2 artists in particular brought the landscape print to a peak that has never been surpassed. The first produced a celebrated series of views of Japan's great sacred mountain, seen from dozens of different places and in different seasons and weathers, one image of which, a great curling wave towering over tiny boats with the mountain small in the distance, has become perhaps the single most recognized image in all of Japanese art. The second created a series depicting the famous post stations along the Great Coastal Highway, capturing travelers in rain and snow and mist, the landscapes and weather, and ordinary human activity of the road. These landscape prints fed directly off the travel culture that the highways had created, letting people who could not make the journey themselves enjoy the famous views from their own homes, and letting those who had traveled relive the experience. They are tender, observant, and utterly distinctive, and when examples eventually reached Europe later in the century, they would have a profound influence on Western painting. Theater reached comparable heights. Kabuki had matured into a spectacular and beloved art form, with elaborate staging, revolving stages, trapdoors, dramatic costumes and makeup, and a repertoire of plays ranging from grand historical dramas to domestic tragedies of love and duty. The great actors were superstars, their images sold as prints, their style and mannerisms imitated, their performances the talk of the cities. The puppet theater, with its astonishingly expressive figures, each operated by multiple puppeteers, in full view of the audience, told many of the same stories with a haunting power of its own. The dramatic literature written for these stages, especially the tragedies built around the unbearable conflict between human feeling and social obligation, between what the heart wants and what duty demands, gave the culture some of its deepest and most characteristic themes. Popular literature flourished alongside the visual and performing arts. The high literacy of the urban population created a hungry market for reading material of every kind, and publishers produced it in abundance. There were comic novels and satirical stories, illustrated popular fiction, travel writing, ghost stories, and practical guides of all sorts. One enormously popular comic novel followed two bumbling travelers on a journey along the Great Highway, stumbling from one misadventure to the next, and it delighted readers precisely because so many of them either had traveled that road or dreamed of doing so. This was a literature written for ordinary people's entertainment, irreverent and worldly, far removed from the solemn classical traditions of the court. The pleasures of this urban culture extended well beyond the arts. The cities offered restaurants and tea houses, public bathhouses, sumo wrestling, seasonal festivals, fireworks displays over the rivers in summer, and the licensed pleasure quarters that gave the floating world its name, walled districts of entertainment that were the subject of so much of the era's art and literature. Fashion became an obsession, with townspeople following the latest styles in clothing, hair, and accessories, and the merchant class in particular using dress and taste to display the wealth that the law forbade them to display through status. The government periodically tried to crack down on all this, issuing sumptuary laws against luxury and extravagance, censoring publications, and restricting the entertainments, especially during the austerity reforms. But the cultural energy of the cities always reasserted itself. The desire of a prosperous, literate urban population for entertainment and beauty proved far stronger than the moralizing decrees of an aging government. There is a deep irony in all of this. The brightest flowering of Tokugawa culture came in the very decades when the political and economic order was visibly decaying, when famines were beginning, when the samurai class was sinking into debt, and when the regime was losing its grip. The civilization the Tokugawa peace had made possible reached its full brilliance just as the system that produced it entered its final decline. Within a generation of these masterpieces being printed, the black ships would arrive and the whole order would begin to collapse. But the floating world the Tokugawa peace created proved more durable than the regime itself. The shogunate is gone, but the prints, the plays, the stories, and the images of that culture remain among the most treasured achievements of Japanese civilization. The enduring gift of 2.5 centuries of peace, Oshio's revolt and the last great reform. The man was Oshio Heihachiro, and his rebellion in 1837 sent a shock through the entire country. Oshio was no outsider. He had served as a respected police official in Osaka, a man of the samurai class, and a learned Confucian scholar with a following of students. He belonged to the establishment. But as the Tempo famine devastated Osaka, Oshio watched in mounting fury as the city's authorities and wealthy merchants hoarded rice, drove up prices, and let the poor starve, all while the shogunate diverted rice from the suffering city to the capital. To Oshio, steeped in a school of Confucian thought that demanded the unity of moral knowledge and moral action, this was an unbearable betrayal of the duty of those in power to care for the people. Oshio first appealed through proper channels, urging the authorities to release rice and relieve the starving. When he was ignored, he made a fateful decision. He sold his entire library, a precious possession for a scholar, to buy rice and weapons for the poor, and he raised an armed uprising against the city government itself. In the early part of 1837, Oshio and his followers rose in revolt, attacking the homes and warehouses of wealthy merchants and setting fires that spread through a large part of Osaka. Their stated goal was to relieve the suffering of the people and to punish the corrupt officials and merchants who had abandoned them. The rebellion was crushed within a day. The shogunate's forces overwhelmed Oshio's small band. Much of the city burned, and Oshio himself went into hiding before eventually taking his own life to avoid capture. As a military event, it was a brief and total failure, but as a symbol, it was devastating. For the first time, a member of the samurai elite, a former official sworn to uphold the order, had taken up arms against the shogunate's own government in the name of the suffering people. It was an unmistakable sign that the regime had lost its moral authority, even among the class that was supposed to be its backbone. Oshio's revolt was suppressed, but it inspired a wave of further uprisings elsewhere, and lodged in the public mind as a damning indictment of a government that could no longer feed or protect its people. The shogunate understood that it faced a crisis, and it responded in the only way it knew how, with another round of austerity reforms in the old mold. These were the Tempo reforms, launched at the start of the 1840s by a senior official named Mizuno Tadakuni. After the long reign of Ienari finally ended, Mizuno reached once more for the familiar tools. He imposed strict frugality and sumptuary laws, cracking down on luxury, entertainment, and extravagance. He tried to force the population back into its proper places and occupations, ordering recent migrants out of the cities and back to the land. He attempted to break up the merchant guilds and monopolies, blaming them for high prices, though this disrupted commerce and made the economic situation worse. He even tried an ambitious and aggressive plan to seize direct control of valuable lands around Edo and Osaka from the daimyo and lesser lords who held them, in order to strengthen the shogunate's own resources. This last measure proved a step too far. The attempt to confiscate land from powerful interests provoked fierce resistance from the daimyo and bannermen whose holdings were threatened, and the opposition was strong enough to defeat the policy outright. Mizuno was forced from office, his reforms collapsing in failure. The Tempo reforms were the last serious attempt by the shogunate to reform itself from within along traditional lines, and their failure was deeply significant. It revealed that the central government no longer had the strength to impose its will even on its own vassals when their interests were seriously threatened. The shogunate's authority was visibly eroding. Some of the great outer domains, particularly in the southwest, were meanwhile reforming their own finances and economies far more successfully than the central government, quietly growing stronger and more independent, even as Edo weakened. So, the situation by the middle of the 19th century was this: a regime 2.5 centuries old, financially exhausted, morally discredited by famine and corruption, unable to reform itself, presiding over a society straining against its frozen structures, and watching some of its most powerful vassals grow stronger than the center. The system was brittle. It had survived this long through sheer institutional inertia and the absence of any serious challenge. What it could not survive was a shock from outside, a force that would expose its weakness for all to see and shatter the long isolation that was the foundation of the entire order. That shock was coming, and it would arrive in the form of 4 black-hulled ships steaming into a bay near Edo. The Black Ships. In July of 1853, a squadron of 4 warships of the United States Navy, under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, sailed into the Bay of Uraga, near the mouth of the bay leading to Edo. 2 of the ships were steam-powered, belching black smoke, painted black, and far larger and more heavily armed than anything the Japanese had ever seen. The Japanese called them the Black Ships, and their arrival is one of the great turning points in the history of the country. They came to force Japan to open its doors after more than 2 centuries of isolation, and the shogunate had no real way to stop them. The United States had several motives. It wanted ports where its whaling ships and merchant vessels crossing the Pacific could take on coal, water, and supplies. It wanted protection for shipwrecked sailors, who under the closed country policy had sometimes been treated harshly. And it wanted to open Japan to trade, part of the broader expansion of Western commercial and imperial power across Asia in this era. Perry carried a letter from the American president addressed to the ruler of Japan, demanding that the country open itself to relations with the United States. He delivered his demands with a deliberate show of overwhelming force, refusing to be turned away to Nagasaki as the Dutch had been, and making clear that he would return the following year with an even larger fleet to receive Japan's answer. The arrival of the Black Ships threw the shogunate into a crisis it was utterly unprepared to handle. For 200 years, the entire foundation of the regime had rested on isolation, and on the shogun's unquestioned authority to manage all relations with the outside world. Now, a foreign power was demanding entry, backed by military technology so far beyond Japan's own that resistance looked hopeless. The shogunate's officials understood, with painful clarity, that their coastal defenses were antiquated, their navy non-existent, and their weapons no match for modern Western artillery and steam-powered warships. They could not fight, but submitting to foreign demands would shatter the policy of seclusion that had defined the regime for centuries, and would amount to a humiliating admission of weakness. In its desperation and uncertainty, the shogunate did something unprecedented, and in doing so, it unwittingly began to dismantle its own authority. The senior official, then leading the government, faced with an impossible decision, broke with centuries of tradition and consulted widely, asking the daimyo and even the imperial court in Kyoto for their opinions on how to respond. This was meant to spread the responsibility for an agonizing choice and to build consensus. But it had a catastrophic side effect. For 2 centuries, the shogunate had ruled by projecting an image of absolute, unquestioned authority over national affairs. By openly asking others what to do, it confessed that it did not know, that it was uncertain and afraid. It invited the daimyo and the court into a national decision from which they had always been excluded. The mystique of shogunal supremacy, carefully maintained for 10 generations, cracked in that moment and never fully recovered. When Perry returned in early 1854 with an even larger fleet, as promised, the shogunate gave in. It signed a treaty with the United States, the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening a couple of ports to American ships for supplies and providing for the care of shipwrecked sailors and the eventual stationing of an American representative. It was a limited agreement, not yet a full commercial treaty, but it was the decisive break. The closed country was closed no longer. Within a short time, similar treaties were signed with other Western powers: Britain, Russia, the Netherlands, all rushing to secure the same access. The 2-century policy of seclusion, the very foundation of the Tokugawa order, had collapsed almost without a shot being fired, undone by the mere threat of force from a technologically superior power. The shock of the Black Ships ran far deeper than the specific terms of any treaty. It exposed, in a way nothing else could have, the fundamental failure of the shogunate. For 200 years, the regime had justified its control by promising stability and protection. Now it had proven unable to protect the country from foreign coercion, unable even to decide how to respond without confessing its own helplessness. Across Japan, and especially among the samurai of the powerful outer domains, and the scholars steeped in national learning's reverence for the emperor, a furious question began to take shape. If the shogun could not defend Japan, what was the shogun for? And if the shogun had failed in his fundamental duty, perhaps it was time for power to return to its true and ancient source, the emperor. The Black Ships had not just opened Japan's ports, they had opened the question of whether the Tokugawa should rule at all. The years of chaos. The years following Perry's arrival, the final phase of the Tokugawa Shogunate, are known as the Bakumatsu, meaning the end of the Bakufu, the end of the shogunate. It was a period of furious political turmoil, assassination, civil conflict, and ideological frenzy as the long-frozen society suddenly came apart under the pressure of the foreign crisis. To understand it, you have to follow the collision of two great forces, the demand of the Western powers for full commercial access, and the rising movement within Japan to expel the foreigners and restore the emperor. The full opening came a few years after Perry, through the efforts of the first American consul, Townsend Harris, who pressed the shogunate hard for a comprehensive commercial treaty. The resulting agreement, and the similar treaties soon signed with other Western powers, opened several ports to full foreign trade and residence, set low tariffs that Japan could not control, and granted foreigners extraterritoriality, meaning they were subject to their own country's laws, rather than Japanese law, while in Japan. These were the unequal treaties, deeply resented as humiliating infringements on Japanese sovereignty. The official who authorized signing the commercial treaty did so without obtaining the formal approval of the imperial court, which had pointedly refused to consent. This was a fateful breach, because it allowed the shogunate's enemies to accuse it not only of weakness before the foreigners, but of acting against the express will of the emperor. That official was Ieyasu, who held the shogunate's highest administrative office during this crisis and tried to govern with an iron hand at the worst possible moment. Facing a fractured ruling class, a disputed shogunal succession, and rising opposition, Ieyasu cracked down hard on his critics in a sweeping purge, arresting, punishing, and executing samurai, scholars, and officials who opposed his policies or favored a rival candidate for shogun. The purge was meant to restore order through fear. Instead, it inflamed the opposition into violence. In early 1860, a group of radical samurai ambushed and assassinated Ieyasu outside one of the gates of Edo Castle, cutting him down in the snow. The assassination of the shogunate's highest official, in broad daylight at the gates of the shogun's own castle, was a stunning blow to the regime's prestige, and a signal that the era of unquestioned Tokugawa authority was truly over. The ideology driving the radicals was captured in a slogan that swept through the country: "Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians." It fused the two great currents of late Edo thought into a single explosive demand. Revere the emperor expressed the national learning conviction that the emperor, not the shogun, was Japan's true and rightful sovereign. Expel the barbarians expressed the fury at the foreign intrusion and the treaties. Together, the slogan was a direct attack on the shogunate, which had both usurped the emperor's authority and surrendered to the foreigners. Young samurai, many of them from the great southwestern domains, embraced this cause with fierce, often fanatical devotion, and the movement grew into a serious political and military force. The shogunate, desperate to shore up its crumbling legitimacy, tried to repair its relationship with the imperial court through a policy of uniting the court and the military government, symbolized by arranging a marriage between the shogun and an imperial princess. But this attempt to borrow the emperor's prestige backfired, because it only confirmed that the shogunate now needed the emperor's blessing to rule, reversing the relationship of the previous 2 centuries. Real initiative was passing to the great outer domains, above all to 2 powerful southwestern provinces, Satsuma and Choshu, which had long resented Tokugawa dominance, had reformed and strengthened themselves, and now became the principal centers of opposition. These domains learned a hard lesson about the foreigners that transformed their strategy. Radical elements in Choshu actually tried to carry out the slogan, firing on foreign ships passing through a strait controlled by the domain. The response was overwhelming. Western fleets bombarded and devastated the Choshu batteries. Satsuma, similarly, was bombarded by a British fleet after the killing of an Englishman. These military lessons were brutal and clarifying. The most militant anti-foreign domains learned firsthand that they could not possibly expel the barbarians by force, that Western military power was simply too great. They drew the crucial conclusion: the goal of driving out the foreigners would have to wait. The immediate task was to overthrow the weak, discredited shogunate, seize control of the country, restore the emperor, and then modernize Japan rapidly enough to deal with the West from a position of strength. Expelling the barbarians gave way to a more practical aim, toppling the Tokugawa. The 2 great rival domains, Satsuma and Choshu, had long been enemies of each other as well as of the shogunate. But in 1866, with the help of skilled go-betweens from the lower samurai ranks, they set aside their rivalry and formed a secret alliance against the Tokugawa. This alliance brought together the 2 strongest anti-shogunate powers in Japan, with their reformed armies increasingly equipped with modern Western weapons. The balance of military force, for the first time in 2.5 centuries, had shifted decisively against the Tokugawa. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and it would be presided over by the last man ever to hold the title of shogun, the last shogun and the fall. The 15th and final shogun of the Tokugawa line was Tokugawa Yoshinobu, who came to the office in late 1866. At the very moment the regime was sliding toward collapse. Yoshinobu was, by most accounts, the most intelligent and capable Tokugawa to hold the title in generations, a man of genuine ability who understood the depth of the crisis far better than most of those around him. He came to power determined to save the shogunate by reforming and strengthening it, drawing on French military advisors to modernize the Tokugawa army and trying to rebuild the central government's capacity. But he had inherited a situation that may well have been beyond saving, and history had run out of room for half measures. The decisive shift came with the death of the reigning emperor and the accession of a new young emperor, around whom the anti-shogunate forces of Satsuma and Choshu, along with their allies among the court nobility, now rallied. These forces no longer wanted a reformed shogunate sharing power. They wanted the shogunate abolished entirely and full authority returned to the imperial throne, which would in practice mean to themselves acting in the emperor's name. Yoshinobu, reading the situation with characteristic shrewdness, made a remarkable and unexpected move. In late 1867, he voluntarily resigned the office of shogun and offered to return governing authority to the emperor. His calculation was subtle. Yoshinobu reasoned that no faction in Japan had the experience or administrative depth to actually run the country, and that even if he gave up the formal title of shogun, the Tokugawa, as by far the largest landholders and most experienced administrators in Japan, would inevitably remain the dominant force in any new government built around the emperor. He would surrender the name in order to keep the substance. It was a clever gambit, and it might have worked, but his enemies in Satsuma and Choshu saw the danger clearly. They had no intention of allowing the Tokugawa to dominate the new order. They wanted the family destroyed as a political force, its vast lands confiscated, its power broken. So in early 1868, the anti-Tokugawa forces seized the initiative with a coup at the imperial court in Kyoto. They proclaimed the full restoration of imperial rule, abolished the shogunate outright, and, crucially, issued demands that Yoshinobu surrender his lands and titles, stripping the Tokugawa of their power base entirely. This went far beyond what Yoshinobu had offered. It was not a graceful transition to a Tokugawa-led imperial government. It was the dispossession and destruction of his house. Faced with this, and pushed by his own outraged retainers who refused to accept such humiliation, Yoshinobu's forces marched on Kyoto, and the country tipped into civil war. This was the Boshin War, the conflict that decided the fate of Japan. It opened with a battle just south of Kyoto, where the Tokugawa forces, despite outnumbering their opponents, were defeated by the better-led and better-equipped Satsuma and Choshu armies, who fought under a brocade banner marking them as the official imperial army. That banner mattered enormously. It transformed the conflict, in the eyes of the country, from a struggle between rival factions into a war between the loyal forces of the emperor and the rebels who opposed him. To fight against the imperial banner was to become a traitor to the throne. Many daimyo who might have supported the Tokugawa now hesitated or switched sides, rather than be branded enemies of the emperor. After this defeat, Yoshinobu made another momentous choice. Rather than fight on to the bitter end and plunge the country into prolonged, devastating civil war, possibly inviting foreign intervention in the process, he chose to submit. He withdrew to Edo and placed himself in a posture of obedience to the imperial court, refusing to lead further resistance. Through negotiations between representatives of the two sides, the great city of Edo, home to over 1 million people, was surrendered peacefully to the imperial forces rather than being destroyed in battle. The seat of Tokugawa power passed into the hands of the new government without the bloodbath that might have consumed it. The largest city in Japan changed hands, and the 2.5-century rule of the Tokugawa over the country effectively ended, not with a final apocalyptic battle, but with a calculated surrender. Resistance did continue in pockets. Some Tokugawa loyalists and allied domains in the north fought on, and a group of holdouts retreated all the way to the northern island of Hokkaido, where they briefly declared a short-lived independent republic and made a last stand before being defeated in the middle of 1869. With their defeat, the Boshin War ended, and organized resistance to the new order was finished. The Tokugawa Shogunate, which had begun on the misty field of Sekigahara in the year 1600, was gone. What replaced it transformed Japan beyond recognition with astonishing speed. The new government, ruling in the name of the young emperor, moved the imperial capital from Kyoto to Edo, which it renamed Tokyo, meaning the eastern capital, taking over the very castle from which the shoguns had ruled. This was the Meiji Restoration, named for the era of the new emperor, and despite its name, it was far less a restoration of the past than a revolution toward the future. The new leaders, many of them the very samurai from Satsuma and Choshu who had toppled the shogunate, set about dismantling the entire Tokugawa system with breathtaking thoroughness. They abolished the domains and the daimyo, replacing them with centrally governed prefectures. They abolished the rigid class system, stripping the samurai of their special status, their stipends, and eventually even their right to carry swords. They built a modern conscript army, a centralized bureaucracy, a national education system, railways, factories, and a constitution. In the space of a single generation, Japan transformed itself from an isolated, agricultural, feudal society into a modernizing industrial power, precisely in order to avoid the fate of colonization that had befallen so much of the rest of Asia. As for the last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, his fate was surprisingly gentle. After his surrender, he was placed under a loose form of confinement, and he then withdrew almost entirely from public life. He lived quietly for decades, pursuing hobbies like photography, hunting, and cycling. A private gentleman in the new Japan he had helped, by stepping aside, to bring into being. He survived long into the 20th century, dying only in 1913. An old man who had been born the heir to a feudal warrior dynasty and lived to see his country build battleships and railways and defeat a European power in war. The contrast between the world he was born into and the world he died in measures the scale of the transformation that the fall of his house set in motion. The Tokugawa achievement is genuinely remarkable when you step back from it. They gave Japan more than 2.5 centuries of internal peace, an almost unheard-of stretch of stability in which a sophisticated urban culture, widespread literacy, a complex commercial economy, and distinctive artistic traditions all flourished. But that same peace was built on isolation, rigidity, and the freezing of society into fixed forms. And in the end, those very features left Japan unable to adapt when the wider world finally came knocking. The system was a masterpiece of stability and a failure of flexibility, and its strengths and its weaknesses were ultimately the same thing. The Tokugawa built a structure designed never to change, in a world that would not stop changing, and when the two finally collided, the structure that had endured for 10 generations came down in less than 2 decades. If you have stayed with me through 2.5 centuries of Japanese history, you clearly have an appetite for the long story, the full picture, the way things actually fit together. That is exactly what this channel is built for. Subscribe, and the next deep history will be waiting for you when it drops. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you now understand the rise and fall of the Tokugawa better than almost anyone you will ever meet. There is another full history waiting on screen right now. That one is next. If 2 hours of this was worth your time, a quick subscribe tells me to keep making them. Thanks for watching.